Hello, welcome to Convergent Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I'm happy to bring the conversation I had with Eugene Finkel. Eugene is the Kenneth H. Keller Professor of International Affairs at Johns Hopkins University. He has his bachelor's in political science and international relations at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and a PhD in political science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. His research focuses on how institutions and individuals respond to extreme situations such as mass violence, state collapse, and rapid change. He's the author of numerous books, including the most recent, Intent to Destroy, Russia's 200-year quest to dominate Ukraine. And that's what we talk about in the conversation. We had this conversation at the very end of last year, so I think it was December, and I kind of held on to it until this week. This week marks 3 years since the invasion of Russia into Ukraine. As we talked about in the conversation, most folks put the start of the war in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea, but of course the invasion was in 2022, and it's been really tough seeing some of the images and things coming out of Ukraine. And at the end of the day, we want there to be peace and the end of the war. How that happens, how that comes about is still a question mark, but I hope that this conversation with Eugene gives some insight into the more recent history of Ukraine and how they've been handling and dealing with Russia next door. We start by talking about a kind of overview of Russia's 200-year crusade to end Ukraine. We talk about identity, shared history, impact of the Mongol and Ottoman empires. We talk about the Donbas and the Crimea regions and why they're so important. We talk about Putin's version of history. We talk about Galicia and the Eastern Front in World War I, brief moment of Ukraine's independence after World War I, Stalin's Russification of Ukraine, Ukraine post-Soviet Union. We, of course, talk about the 2014 annexation of Crimea, start of the current war, the 2022 invasion, the current state of the war, where things are at, what peace would look like, and many other topics. I really enjoyed this conversation. It gave a lot of insight and awareness into many things that I was unaware of. And so Eugene is wonderful on this, and he's kind of his feet in different worlds. He's a political science and a little bit of the history and and some international relations. So he's just wonderful in conversation, and his book is fantastic. As always, you can find this conversation and all other conversations at convergingdialogues.substack.com. I'm also on YouTube. So if you like what you hear, please subscribe. That's always helpful. Subscribing really does help. Telling your friends if you like this episode or any of the other 400 plus episodes. There's plenty of things there. Always helpful when folks share and more folks subscribe. Always is a nice thing to see. And hopefully you like what I'm doing here. And I hope that you also support Eugene's work, buy his book. And now I bring you Eugene Finkel. I'm here with Eugene Finkel. Eugene, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so for sure. So you've written a wonderful book. It's called Intent to Destroy, Russia's 200-year quest to dominate Ukraine. And I certainly learned a lot, and there's a lot of really important details in here. So we'll get all into it. Before we do, just tell listeners kind of a sort of snapshot of who you are professionally, academically, all the particulars there.
Right. So I'm a professor of international affairs at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. I'm based at the Johns Hopkins Europe campus in Bologna, Italy. I was born in Ukraine. We left Ukraine when I was 13. It was still Soviet Union. Grew up in Israel. Went to the US to do my PhD in political science, and then stayed until a couple of years ago when I moved back to Europe. I mostly work on political violence, the Holocaust, genocide, and all the other happy stuff.
Mm, yeah. So that's a lot of events there. That's a cool arc. So Ukraine to then you have Israel in there, and then you got U.S. and now you're in Italy. You've done a lot of nomading around the world for a couple of years. That's pretty cool.
Yeah. I'm used to packing stuff and shipping it around the world, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's great though. Okay, so yeah, as I said, there was a lot in the book here that you cover so much detail and history, and it's not a large book. It's synthesized really well. It's really really good in that way. So let's start with, I guess, we'll start current and go backwards. So most people will know the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Of course, as we'll discuss, the war really starts in 2014. We'll get there, but the full scale invasion was in 2022. One of the biggest moments since the Cold War ended. Why 200 years? You say that there's a 200-year history of Russia trying to destroy Ukraine. What is this intent to destroy? How's it put around identity and security there?
Right. So I think you already touched on the key point that there is a perception that the war started in 2022, and that's true. The current phase of the war started in 2022, and people who go back a bit further say no, it's actually started in 2014 with Russian annexation of Crimea and the war in the Donbas, which was started by essentially Russian citizens with close ties to the Kremlin and security services or history in the security services. And my argument is that yes, that's correct, but that's just the current phase of the war. And if we want to understand really what happened and what drives Russia and what are they after, both to understand the war and also to understand how we get out of it and how we achieve peace, we need to understand their motivations, and to understand those motivations, we need to go back to the times when Russian nationalism in its modern form first appeared, and that's more or less in mid 19th century, where the idea that Russian and Ukrainians and also Belarusians the same people starts taking hold, becomes an official ideology, and we still see quite a lot of those ideas driving Russian actions, driving Putin. I mean, he's very explicit about that as well. If you read what he and people around him say about Ukraine and how they justify the invasion, it's not about NATO. It's about Russians and Ukrainians are the same people that speak essentially the same language. Ukrainian is a dialect of Russian, and therefore they belong to the same state, which of course should be dominated by Moscow. Those ideas come from the 19th century, even a bit earlier, but they become policy in mid 19th century. So what I wanted to do in this book is, to take a step back and get to the origins, because I started it with trying to understand the contemporary war. I'm not an historian, I'm a political scientist. But as I started writing, I figured out I can't explain what's happening now without going back in time. And I went back in time until somehow I hit 19th century and became an historian. So that's essentially what the book is about, trying to trace the continuities in Russian policies towards Ukraine since mid-19th century up until 2022 and later.
Well, you could have fooled me. I mean, you do quite a good bit of history, and it was easy to follow. So it was very very nice. So so let me ask on this point. There's this you talked about it in the book, and I'm curious. Russia and Ukraine do have a lot of overlap in their histories, in their in language and culture, and there's a lot of overlap. In some ways, I think you say somewhere in the book they're kind of like brothers of sorts. They're not the same, but a very similar people. In terms of identity, this is I guess the question, a very difficult question. I mean, what does it mean, I guess, to be Ukrainian, and what does it mean to be Russian? Right? I mean, they do have the origins, their roots trace back to similar places. But I guess tell us about that kind of overlap with how they're similar but also different.
Right. So, and that's the core of the war, and that's the problem for Ukraine and also Russia, because and this wrapped perception of what Russia is and who Russians are. I don't want to sound predetermined, but there is an obsession on Ukraine and the Russian, in the Russian understanding of history. So essentially, the stories of both Russia and Ukraine starts in Ukraine, in or around Kiev and the medieval state called the Kievan Rus, which was most of the current Ukrainian territory, Belarus, most of Western Russia, which was a pretty well successful state until it got destroyed by the Mongols in the 13th century. And then the western part became controlled by Lithuania and Poland, and the more eastern part became what eventually became Russia. And as Russia grew in size and in power, it still traced its own history and its own identity back to Kiev, and the idea was that's where we start from. That's our, which is, it might be fine if it's just history or myths. The problem is that Kiev is also a capital of a different country, right? So essentially, for now, it's a kind of, it's an inheritance dispute of sorts in the Russian mind, and Russians from the very beginning got very stuck on this idea of their natural right to control all those territories that belong to Kiev and Rus, and also a mission of this imperial mission of bringing them back under the same umbrella. And that's the Russian notion of history. The Russian state is a state that should control all those lands, that all people who live in those lands are essentially Russians. Russians are the great Russians, Ukrainians are little Russians, Belarusians are white Russians, but they're all Russians. And of course, once you start using terms like great and little Russians, it implies a hierarchical relationship, who is on top, who is in charge, even though originally those were pure geographic terms, and that the language the Ukrainians speak is just a dialect of Russian. And that's the Russian perspective. The Ukrainian perception is leave us alone, at least as of now. We are not. There was quite powerful, movement or tendency among Ukrainians to see themselves as part of this broader Russian family. It's not that just Russians just invented it and pushed it on Ukrainians. Quite a lot of this historical myth or this perception of who Russians are came from people who are based in Ukraine or originated in Ukraine. But at some point when the Russian perception switched from, yes, we're great Russians and those are little Russians, but we're not the same, to trying to push the Russian language and the Russian identity onto Ukrainians, that's created a pushback among people in what is now Ukraine, and the beginning of a separate national identity that says, well, we're actually not Russians, and Ukraine is not Russia, and as I said, literally, leave us alone. We want to be different. And that's still the perception the core of the conflict and the perception of Ukrainians. Russians would say, yes, we are the same, and yes, you belong to us, and yes, we have a natural right to control you, and that's why we invaded, and that's why we're coming to save you from all those nefarious Western forces who want to control you. And the Ukrainian perception was, no, we are not. We are not Russians. We speak a separate language. We have a separate history. We have a separate identity. We want to be on our own, and that's the core of the conflict from the 19th century up until this very day. That's the kind of historical battle or historical argument that essentially turns into a hot war that we're seeing right now, a war about identity.
Yeah. So it really all starts with Kiev, right? I mean, you kind of mentioned Kiev goes back to in the previous millennium, right? I mean, Kiev has been around for a long time as a place, like it's been around for many, many years. I mean, I'm sure there was a time before Kiev of sorts, maybe many, 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 many years ago, but that's where it kind of all starts is, Kiev is kind of the central place. It happens to be in, Ukraine now. And so is it really just trying to, I mean, in some ways it's, obviously identity and history is super important for many people groups, especially ones that are pretty, have been around for a while. But I guess that's the question, right? Is, well, what's wrong with saying, yeah, like we had a history together at some point. We do have maybe a same origin or starting point in and around Kiev, but now we don't. History evolves and it changes, and now this is Ukraine, we're Russia. I mean, is it simply just that? Is it more than that?
It's not just that. I mean, that's the key. That's the core. And you're right. It starts with Kiev. And there is a saying in Russian that the Kiev is mother of all Russian cities. So, but it's not just ideas. It's, what politicians do about those ideas.
Sure.
And that's the second stage about how those ideas start driving history. And Russia historically is an empire, and once you combine those ideas about what belongs to us and this imperial mindset that never went away, that's when you get from ideas to action. So you're right. It's quite possible to say, yes, that's where our history begins, but it is history. Unfortunately for Ukrainians and also for Russians, this process of separating, history and Ukrainian identity from politics never happened in Russia. In Russian thinking, it was ours, and therefore it ought to belong to us, and we will do what we can, at least now that it will become our again. And this Russian imperial mission comes from several sources. First, the perception that Russia is a new Rome. That, there was the first Rome, then the second Rome was the Byzantium, Constantinople. But once the Constantinople fell, Moscow became literally the third Rome with an imperial identity and imperial mission. It also comes from the Mongols, and quite a lot about Mongol imperial and political outlook, and even the language that they use to, in political terms also comes from the Mongols. So you have a state with an imperial mindset that never really confronted this mindset and did not do much about it, and an idea that this is our territory, that's our core, that's the origin of our state that should belong to us, that becomes policy. There was a wonderful saying by a British historian, Geoffrey Hosking, that the difference between the United Kingdom and Russia, that United Kingdom had an empire. So they would just leave the colonies like the US go and still remain England. Russia, on the other hand, was an empire. So being an empire is a core of its identity, and Russia, unfortunately, has not come with a different vision of what it is that shed this imperial history. And that's why when Russian leaders think what they can do next to become, to be remembered as great leaders, then this imperial restoration is very high on the agenda. Now, also, again, I don't want to say that it's all about identity. Right, and I'm sure we will get to that as well. But essentially, my argument is that the war is not about NATO. It's not about security. And right now, as we're talking about what will happen next and what President-elect Trump will do. So the debate is whether Russians are going to keep the territories they occupy or not. But for me, it's beside the point. Russia did not start the war to control the Donbas. Right? They want Kiev. They trace their history to Kiev, and unless we start seriously talking about ideas rather than assuming that it's just propaganda or Putin is cynical and he doesn't really mean it, we're not going to solve this conflict.
Yes, that's a good point. You mentioned, just real quick here, you mentioned the Mongols. Yeah, Mongols are fascinating group, and they had a big empire for a long time. So you had the Mongols and you had the Ottoman Empire, and of course the Ottomans were for 600 years up until World War One, end of World War One. How much of that impact you started to touch on a little bit there of the Mongol and the Ottoman empires? They're really close together. Um, they reigned over parts of Ukraine and Russia, modern day Ukraine, Russia regions. How much of the impact of the Mongols and the Ottomans were there in Ukraine?
Well, so the Mongol impact is mostly on Russia
Mm,
and their imperial thinking and political approach. The Ottoman Empire impacted both Ukraine because you're right, it controlled a large chunk of Ukraine either directly or through Crimean Khanate, which was an Ottoman vassal state.
mm,
But it was even more important for Russia because for Russia it was their bogeyman. It's like the bugbear that's the non-Christian country that controls the second Rome, the Constantinople. So in the Russian thinking, that was the ultimate goal, to drive the Ottomans, the Muslims, out of Constantinople and to make it Christian again. So that's why the Russian Empire, from throughout most of the 18th and 19th century, was so obsessed with Ukraine and southern Russia and Crimea and the Ottoman Empire. It wasn't just about Ukraine or access to the Black Sea. The end goal was to liberate Constantinople and to make it Christian again. In Ukraine itself, both empires, not just the Ottomans, but also the Polish kingdom that controlled most of Ukraine, essentially jointly created the Ukrainian nation because it was a frontier zone between the empire, extremely violent, not really governed by anyone, and that's where we see the first beginnings of Ukrainian nation, out of people who tried to carve out their space between the Poles and the Ottomans by being neither.
mm. It's interesting because you have, I think for some listeners that may know this, but they may not, is that Ukraine is, you're mentioning this piece about Constantinople, modern day Istanbul, which was kind of the seat of where, world affairs was at the time, I guess. And so, you have, if you think of the Black Sea, the northern shore, northern coast is a lot of Ukraine, but the southern coast of the Black Sea is really right there on Istanbul or Constantinople. So you can literally see, some of the advantages there to trying to get through Ukraine to get to Constantinople. It makes a lot of sense. Tell us about, I guess, sort of a bit, because it will come up in modern context, is Crimea and the Donbas. So people will talk about, you turn on the news, you watch a documentary, people talk about these regions a lot. And obviously in 2014, you have the annexation. So why is Crimea, and again, from what I understand, is that there's a lot of, specific ethnic groups that are in some of these regions as well, which makes this a little bit more complicated. What is the importance from the Russian side, but also for the Ukrainian side, of these particular regions? There's Kiev, obviously, a lot of historical influence, impact, etc. And, it's the capital of Ukraine. But what is the importance of Crimea and the Donbas? It seems like it's been important for the past 200 years, maybe more. Why? What's so particular about these regions?
Well, the importance is different in how Russians and Ukrainians think about those regions. So Donbas is mostly a Ukrainian, it's used to be a mostly Ukraine majority land that became in the late 19th century heavily industrialized because it has coal mines, it had central location, it had easy access to the Black Sea. And this industrialization meant a lot of boom towns and a lot of industry, mostly populated by Russians trying to escape poverty within Russia.
Mm.
So the importance of Donbas for Russia was originally industrial. That was one of the cores of the Russian industry. But more importantly, because most of the cities were Russian and Russian speaking, the importance of Donbas became perceived as a kind of an extension of Russia in the Russian mind, mostly for ethnic and linguistic reasons. Still, the majority of the population there is Ukrainian, but they speak Russian, and there is a very substantial Russian minority.
Mm.
Crimea is very different. The difference of Crimea is both mythological and symbolic. The baptism of Kievan Rus, or at least the baptism of the Prince of the Kievan Rus, more than 1,000 years ago, according to sources, took place somewhere in Crimea, probably near Sevastopol, and therefore, for Russians, it's not just a historically important land; it's a religious origin of Christianity in Russia, and for people who are religious or pretend to be religious, like Putin, that is important. That's why Putin, when he talks about Crimea, talks about it being similar to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem for the Jews, because they trace, the Christianity in Russia to Crimea. It also has a huge symbolic reason because Sevastopol, the port city in Crimea and the base of the Black Sea, is for Russians literally a city of Russian military glory. That's a city that was besieged during the Crimean War in 1853 up until 1856, and the long and brutal siege during the World War. Now, being a city of military glory also means that Russia lost the city twice. And despite, and maybe even because of that, if you look at, center of what Russians associate with military glory or marital glory for the empire and for the Soviet Union, it will be Stalingrad, of course, and Moscow, but also Sevastopol. So for more patriotically minded, more nationalist-minded people, it is where their glorious military histories. And for most Russian, it was the Soviet Florida. It was the vacation land. That's where you would go for your summer vacations. That's where you would enjoy the sea. So for pretty much everyone in the Soviet Union does have this, myself included, by going to Crimea for their summer vacation, and weather was beautiful. It's pretty. We couldn't travel outside the Soviet Union, but that was, this exotic land with a beautiful sea, Greek city names, Turkish-sounding name of nature. So you felt as if you are not even in the Soviet Union, not in the Soviet Union, and for people who are nostalgic about the Soviet Union, just nostalgic about their life 30 years ago, because we used to be so much younger 30 years ago. A lot of those memories are centered on Crimea. So it's this toxic mix of religion, military history, and just mundane nostalgia for better, more predictable life. They all center on Crimea, and that's why Russians are absolutely obsessed with Crimea.
Yes, that's really, really helpful. The only thing I know is it gives a lot of more color to it. The only thing I know about Sevastopol is the Sevastopol sketches that Tolstoy wrote, where he talks about that war in 1850, whatever it was. And so I think it's a little bit of historical fiction, obviously, from Tolstoy. But I remember reading that when I was younger, and it's pretty eye-opening in a lot of ways. So let's take a footnote here a bit. It is a little bit more speeding up towards the modern time. I think it was earlier this year. I can't remember. Putin did a long sit down with Tucker Carlson, which I watched painfully, And it was interesting. I've also seen the documentary Oliver Stone did on him a couple years back. So I mean, I know a few things about Putin. Again, based on folks going there and interviewing him. He loves his propaganda, of course, but he seems to have this cherry-picked version of history. You know, he goes on a 20-minute monologue about all of these things. He's talking about, you know, Catherine the Great. He's talking about, you know, the Tsar. He's talking about all this stuff. He's talking about like this very cherry. And I remember listening to this. And look, I mean, he gives a very, you know, nice, you know, linear narrative that makes a lot of sense. If the average, you know, Russian person or, you know, non-Ukrainian person, you know, outside of the region didn't know anything about this history, be like, yeah, what is the problem here? Like, yeah, he's just, he's good at that stuff of sorts. But I guess you can talk about that if you want. But this idea of Russian unification and all these things, but you put the Napoleonic Wars as everything that changed everything. And so this historical unity relies on repression of Ukrainian culture. It kind of starts there. And Putin has a certain way in which he likes to cherry pick that. What are your thoughts, I guess, about kind of more modern context? What's going on there?
What's going on with Putin or with his version of history?
Well, with his version of history. We'll get to him later, but with his version of history, I guess. Because some people would look at that and be like, yeah, that makes sense. But you need an objective kind of way of seeing this. And for you, based on, you know, what you read and analyzed, how do you see it?
Right. So what this painful painful interview of Tucker Carlson before that, everything that Putin was throwing at us and screaming about, what he thinks about Ukraine. It's a very simple story that, it starts where we ended with the Mongols and, Ukraine is part of Poland, but then Moscow suddenly breaks free of Mongols and start what they called, quote unquote, gathering the Russian lands. And then there is a rebellion in Ukraine against the Poles. And once the rebels start losing to Poland, they ask Moscow for protection and presumably join the Russian state or unified themselves with the Russian state. And that's what, at least according to this version of history, both the Russians and Ukrainians always hoped for, and they live happily ever after because, after all, they are the same people. That's a very linear story. That's the Russian story that, that they're the benevolent gatherers of Russian land who protected the Ukrainians, and Ukrainians always wanted to be part of Russia because they're Russian. So what the beef is really about, right? What you don't have in this history are the Ukrainians.
Right.
Because the Ukrainian version of history, which of course no Tucker Carlson would ever get into because it's too complicated, is that yes, at some point in 17th century, Ukrainian leaders did ask Moscow for protection and did recognize, the Russian Tsar as a sovereign, but they were thinking about something very different from complete unification, and they never wanted to be unified with Russia, and they wanted to keep their, liberty and privileges that Russians had took away. And in between, they also banned the Ukrainian language and killed lots of people and starved millions in Ukraine. And just, again, as I said, let us be, leave us alone. We don't want to be unified with you. Right? That's not the history that Putin tells us, and it's not the history that Putin is interested in hearing, because in his perception, those who tell this history are brainwashed by the West, or just repeat the conspiracy theories that the Western created. In his view, the entire idea of Ukrainians as Ukrainians rather than little Russians is it's an invention of, depending on the period, it can be the CIA, it can be the Poles. Originally, it was the Austro-Hungarian military intelligence. So the view was that literally there are people in the Austrian army general staff who are sitting there and creating the Ukrainians out of Russians just to harm Russia. So what he tells us is really a very standard history that is there since the 19th century. That's why I'm talking about 200 years, because those are the beginnings of this narrative. Nothing changed. If you took what he told Carlson, or his famous essay that he published half a year before the invasion, of the historical unity of the Russian and Ukrainians, you could literally copy. You could look at this, and you could look at texts of Russian nationalism from the late 19th century, and it will be almost copy-paste. You would not even know who wrote it, whether it's Putin or some of those older guys. And that's, again, another reason why I start with the 19th century, because the ideas that drive Putin are the same ideas that drove Russian nationalists 200 years ago about what Ukraine is and who Ukrainians are.
Yeah, I think there's a lot that's left out there very selectively. So going a little bit further in 20th century here, we get to kind of World War I. And we get to, there's this region, Galicia, which was tremendous for the Eastern Front of World War I. I recently had a conversation with Nick Lloyd, who just wrote a great book on the Eastern Front. It's a fabulous book, and Galicia is like prime, region there. So he kind of gives a lot of treatment to a part of the war that usually doesn't get talked about. It's fabulous history there. I guess, from your vantage point, what was, kind of Russia's involvement in the war here? But really, I talked about this with Nick. I'm curious for your perspective here. How impactful was the Russian Revolution for the war, but also for the collapse at the time of the empire, and then making sort of Ukraine a little bit of this reality? Talk about that significance.
Right. Yeah, Galicia is a very interesting part of the story. And again, that's where the story becomes even more complicated, and that's why Tucker Carlson would never be able to comprehend it, because you need to understand more. So the story is basically this: once the Russian Empire starts growing, it, together with the Austrians and the Prussians, start partitioning Poland. Most of Ukraine goes to the Russian Empire, but there is one relatively small, originally Kievan Rus, Ukraine/Ukrainian region, Galicia, that goes to the Austrians. And up until mid-20th century has a completely different history from Russia. And while Russians in the Russian Empire tried to impose on the most of Ukraine that they control this linear vision of Ukrainians are Russian and unification and this joint origin story, and that people are little Russians rather than Ukrainians. People in Galicia, which is also, by the way, the region where I come from, they have none of that, right? They live in Austria. And Austria is much more open, much more tolerant. Their people, Ukrainians, are allowed to speak their own language. They're allowed to form parties. They're allowed, to create this different history that has very little to do with the Russians. And it becomes this breeding ground for Ukrainian nationalism, and also a place of refuge for Ukrainians for Ukrainian politicians and scholars from the Russian Empire. They move there and start developing their ideas, and it scares the hell out of the Russian Empire. Because in 20th century, when ideas of political legitimacy based on divine right of kings no longer hold, they need to convince people. They need to get the population behind them, and they know the math. Together, Russians and Ukrainians are about 2/3 of the Russian Empire. If those little Russians decide that they are not Russians, they're something else, they're Ukrainians, then the share of Russians in the empire drops to about 45%. So essentially, Russians become a minority in their own empire, And that is extremely scary for the government in St. Petersburg. And they blame the Ukrainians in Galicia for poisoning the minds of Ukrainians in Russia. That's why the idea is that that people in the in the Austrian general staff are invading the Ukrainians. Take hold, they see it as a conspiracy against Russia. So for them, and I'm sure you covered it with Nick Lloyd, there is the perception that World War I is about the Balkans.
Yeah.
But from the Russian perspective at that time, it's much more about Ukrainians. They need Galicia both to finally unify all those historical lands, but even more importantly, to crack down on Ukrainian nationalism there. And that's why once the war began, their key goal is to annex Galicia, to destroy the Ukrainian educational system, to destroy the Ukrainian political life there. And in fact, as I was writing this book, what was for me was most astonishing. I would look at what Russians did in Galicia once they occupied it. They controlled Galicia for about a year. In 1914 and 1915. I wasn't doing military history. I was more interested in their policies towards, Ukrainian language and Ukrainian education and Ukrainian identity. And writing it in 2022, 2023, I could see this, literally the same things, the same policies to the T happening in occupied Ukraine right now. You would just change the date and the place, but besides that, it would be absolutely the same. They would ban Ukrainian language. They would change the curriculum. They would even introduce the Russian time zone into this region. They would go after Ukrainian politicians and activism and imprison them or exile them. They would force the idea that Ukrainians or Russians, they would start bringing teachers from Russia to Galicia to educate Ukrainians there that they're actually not Ukrainians and it's Russians. So this small region was absolutely, because it was outside of the Russian control and they could not repress people there and indoctrinate them as they did in Ukraine, it was so crucial for the Russian Empire to control it. They did it for 10 months in 1914, 1915. They failed. They came back in 1939 and finally annexed Galicia to the Soviet Union, but it always remained different from the Soviet Ukraine. And that's why the Russification of Ukrainian failed, because there was always this island outside the Moscow's control, where people who spoke Ukrainian could envision a different non-Russian future for the region. But generally, it's an extremely interesting story of what was going on in Galicia in 1939 in 1914, and it also shows you. It's another way to show the continuities between the past and the current war. What Russians are doing right now in occupied Ukraine is exactly what they did in 1915, 1914 in Galicia. Not because, I don't think anyone in the Kremlin knows what they did back then. It's just the goals are the same and the policies therefore remains the same.
Yeah, I mean, this is the kind of the really important piece of knowing history really well, kind of objective history, if you will. Because you don't want to make the same mistakes, or you can learn from it. So that's it's a very powerful kind of comparison there. In the end, Ukraine does get some sovereign statehood, and you talk about after the war and after the Russian Revolution, I should say as well, that in the 20s and 30s there was Ukrainian language and culture, and they really seemed to be thriving alongside, which is interesting, a USSR. You talk about how 80% of primary education in Ukraine in 1927 was there, and that there was this big cultural explosion. Just talk about how Ukrainians really thrived after the war in the 20s and 30s.
Right, absolutely. So So, from what they say, it might seem as if it's kind of a deterministic story that Russians are, forced by history to be obsessed with Ukraine and try to control Ukraine, and there is nothing we can do about it. And what I try to show in the book that no, it's also choices. Being obsessed with Ukraine is a choice, and at times Russian leaders or Soviet leaders could make different choices. And one of those periods is after the Russian Revolution and the Civil War, the first years of the Soviet Union, where the communist leadership was really scared of Russian nationalism, because Russian nationalism was closely associated with the monarchy and the threat to communism, so they wanted to do something different. They wanted to crack down on Russian nationalism, and the way to do it was to elevate minorities and to allow them to thrive. There was a policy of promoting local languages, and not just in Ukraine, but throughout the Soviet Union, and investing in local minorities' culture and political representation, obviously within the framework of communism. You wouldn't stray from communism, but within the socialist communist framework, you can speak your own language, you can produce, you got some preferences. One historian called the Soviet Union back then an affirmative action empire, because that's essentially what it was. And there was a period in 1920s and 1930s where Ukraine went through a period of investing in Ukrainian culture, in Ukrainian identity, in Ukrainian literature, in Ukrainian education, precisely to minimize this impact of Russian nationalism, which the communist authorities feared. Not because, the Moscow or the communists love Ukrainians, absolutely not. But for them, it was an effective way to keep minorities, to keep Russian nationalism down and not to threaten the regime. The problem was, though, that Stalin was adamantly opposed to those minorities. He, over time, became a Russian nationalist, even though he was ethnically Georgian, but he started seeing himself as a Russian nationalism. And for him, this emergence of a separate Ukrainian culture and Ukrainian identity within the Soviet Union was a threat, because Ukraine was just too important. Not just historically, but strategically. It's close to the West. It produces most of Soviet bread. So it has Donbas, which is a huge industrial hub. So once Stalin comes to power, this period is over, and he starts cracking down very violently on Ukrainian intelligentsia, on Ukrainian writers. Most of them are either killed or exiled, and this short period of Ukrainization is over and Russification comes back.
Yeah, when I was reading this, it was it's like, oh, they're thriving, they're doing well, they have all these things, and then you see Stalin, and over time, you mentioned how important this was, that after 20 plus years of independence, they're back under Russian control. So I guess, what happens during, Stalin and trying to, and taking back, Ukraine, and then, we get to World War II, and there ends up being all of these different factions that go on, from Ukrainian nationalists and all these other things. Yeah, what's the story here during this period, in the lead up to World War II, and then during and after a little bit?
Right. So Stalin comes to power, and one of the first things he does is to crack down on all those minority cultures and minority nationalisms. He wants to have a centralized state where he controls everything, and therefore all those cultures and educational systems and languages ought to go. He's also obsessed with a potential attack from the West, that he believes that Soviet Union is about to be invaded from the West, and that's where Ukraine is, so Ukraine needs to be put under control from Moscow because it's strategically important. And he also believes that the way to build a strong state is industrialization. The way to get industrialization is to bring money and technology and machines from the West. How you do it? You need to export some. What Soviet Union can export? Grain. Where the grain is? Ukraine. So the state starts a policy of centralizing agriculture, collectivizing private farming, putting all those people in collective farms where they can be much more easily controlled, and the state can take whatever they produce. Collectivization, though economically, is a disaster. It removes all the incentives for people to produce more because they don't control everything and lose everything they had. But the state still comes in and take what it needs to sell overseas. So the result is massive famine that hits Ukraine especially hard. We still don't know how many people died. The estimates range between probably 3.54 to 5 million people who die mostly in Ukrainian countryside. The cities are spared. The cities get the food they need. The cities also speak Russian. But the Ukrainian-speaking countryside is starved deliberately so. And that's for Stalin first a way to get grain for export and then industrialize the Soviet Union. Second, to break the back of Ukrainian nationalism, because for him, the core of the nationalism is not the cities, it's the countryside, which is more conservative, more independent-minded. That's why people still speak Ukrainian. So starving them removes the opposition. And unfortunately for Ukraine, he does succeed through terror, famine, repressions to make Ukraine obedient, to make it mostly Russian-speaking. And that's how we get to World War II, where Moscow is full control of Ukraine, but Galicia and another part of Western Ukraine that was part of the Russian Empire, but then goes to Poland in 1920s, they're outside of Moscow's control, and this Ukrainian nationalism still exists. And in 1939, Stalin teams up with Hitler. They signed the secret pact, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, where they once again partitioned Poland. And in 1939, September 1st, Germany invades Poland from the west. September 17th, Soviet Union invades Poland from the east. And the goal is very explicit. The goal is, quote unquote, to liberate Ukrainians and Belarusians, to bring them back under Moscow's control. Again, if you look at the rhetoric from 1939 to 2022, the rhetoric is extremely similar, right? And finally, for the second time when they do it, they succeed. And since 1939, Western Ukraine and Galicia are part of Ukraine for Soviet Ukraine, and then independent Ukraine. But essentially, it is Stalin who unified Ukraine under single rule, not because he liked Ukrainian, but because that made for him easier to repress and control those Ukrainians in the West.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you bring us up to, Ukraine is part of the Soviet Union, the war ends, and you really get us up to the end of the USSR in 91. And, again, this story becomes Crimea, the Donbas, Ukraine as a whole is rightfully Russian, et cetera, even still up until, this period. After all that history that happens, there's still this belief. So you can talk about that. We've mentioned a little bit already, but Ukraine becomes independent again post 91. And I guess it was interesting. You talk a little bit about, again, things are contextually important here, but, it was interesting how the rest of the world, including the United States, received an independent Ukraine, right? You also mentioned this other bit of it, which was, I think Bill Clinton talked about this recently, that, throughout the 90s, that it's very regretful that Ukraine got rid of its nuclear weapons and they didn't join NATO. And I remember seeing some clip of Clinton saying, like, you know, he regretted that, it was a big mistake or something like that. I remember, but you know, this is a footnote. Bill Clinton is going back and just like he's like annotating all of his history. Like, yeah, I really regretted that one. Yeah, I should have got bin Laden, and we shouldn't have signed the '94 crime bill, and Arafat should have taken the deal in 2000. Ukraine should have joined NATO. He's just going back and annotating all of his time as president. But yeah, just post 91, you know, Ukraine's independent again, but how was it for them? How did the rest of the world receive them? And then, yeah, why weren't they able to join NATO, and why did they get rid of nukes?
Right. So you're right. 1991, and we skip most of the Soviet period. Ukraine is independent again. But what happened in between is the process that Stalin started with forcibly Russifying Ukraine and cracking down on Ukrainian identity and Ukrainian education takes hold. And essentially, for most of the Soviet period after World War II, most of Ukraine does become Russified. There is also an influx of people from Russia into Ukraine, mostly Donbas, but also Crimea, where the indigenous Crimean Tatar population is expelled and not allowed to return. You know, the number of people who speak Ukrainian goes down. Most people switch to Ukrainian, with the exception of this western region in Galicia, where people still speak Ukrainian on the street, where there is still Ukrainian culture and education. But the result is that when Soviet Union collapses and Ukraine does become independent, most people do not perceive it as a different state. For people both in Russia and in the West, Ukrainians and Russians are essentially the same people. So why bother with having a separate state? And those in Ukraine who do see themselves as different, having an extremely hard time, you know, to convincing people, not just in Russia. I mean, there was not much conversation to be had with Russian nationalists, but people in the West, people like Bill Clinton, that, you know, we're actually a different state, we're different people. We are not just, you know, Russia's little brother or some kind of historical curiosity that will come to its senses and rejoin Russia. And they fail. They fail because the idea that because Ukrainians are essentially Russians becomes ingrained in the West. It also fails because all the experts on the Soviet Union and then on the post-Soviet space are essentially experts on Russia. It was extremely hard for Western scholars to travel to Ukraine during Soviet times. There were no consulates in Kiev. And if people in the West wanted to understand Russia, you know, for academic reasons, so, you know, CIA, military security, they all learned Russian. So they adopted this Russocentric perspective of the world that carried over from Soviet times to post-Soviet times. And the result was, first of all, what exactly this state is, right? What's the logic behind it? We can't understand. They're all Russians. Second, the centrality of Russia for Clinton. Clinton, and, you know, at least you're right, he's going back and annotating his history, but I think he should be given credit for doing that and recognizing the mistakes that he made. So for Clinton, you know, when he thinks about region, he's thinking about Russia and Russian interests, and there is and people around him as well. So once, you know, Soviet Union collapses and those states need to decide on the borders and need to decide what to do with the legacy of the Soviet Union, including the nuclear weapons. There is a tremendous push, tremendous pressure on Ukraine to give up nuclear weapons, to transfer them to Russia, because Russia is presumed to be this legitimate heir of the Soviet Union. You know, Russian security takes priority over everyone else, and Ukrainians are, you know, struggling to explain it. I mean, they understand why would Russian nationalists want weak, disarmed Ukraine that cannot protect itself. They try to convince the West, people like Clinton, they fail because those decades of Russification convinced everyone in the West that Ukrainians are Russian and this Ukrainian state makes no sense. So Ukraine is forced to give up their nuclear weapons essentially in exchange for nothing. And when Ukrainians start complaining, well, Russians are actually imperialist and they do want to take Crimea and the Donbas back because they don't really see us as a legitimate state. Very few people are listening to them. And that's how and as long as Russian leadership is keen on keeping peace, that's fine. Yes, Ukraine is weak, Ukraine is defenseless, but Russia under Yeltsin is not going to attack them. Once Putin comes to power, Putin, who is much more nationalist than Yeltsin and is becoming much more religious and much more irredentist, that's where the trouble for Ukraine begins.
Yeah. Well, and he's there and hasn't left, so
yeah.
And he's probably not going to anytime soon. So, okay, so bring us up to, I guess, modern period. So 2014, what happened? Why? I mean, there was obviously things don't just poof happen, in one moment. Of course, I'm sure there was a build up to this. But, how was, the annexation in Crimea and the war in the Donbas, how did that start the current war? We talked about this in the beginning a little bit. And then I guess what happened between 2014 and 2022, where people didn't see it as a war and we weren't getting the coverage and we weren't getting all the things that were happening. But really the 2022 invasion is where it's like, okay, now we're here. This is a big deal. Talk about this.
Right. So what happens is that Ukraine does want to be independent and does try to build a separate identity. Partly because, they see what Russia is and they don't want to build like that. Partly because Ukrainians are different in their outlook than Russians. They are much more Western oriented. They also don't have oil, so they need to build, and gas, they need to build a more functioning market with a lot of private industry. So Ukrainians throughout 1990s and 2000 tried to build their own state, while Russians are still simmering in those ideas that actually Ukraine is Russia and Ukrainians are Russians. And what we see in 2014 is the final clash of those beliefs, where Russians believe that they have a right to dominate Ukraine and to control Ukraine, and Ukrainians try to find their independent existence. So there is a political crisis in Ukraine where the Russian leadership and Putin forced the Ukrainian president at that time, Viktor Yanukovych, who is very unpopular, extremely corrupt, to join a geopolitical alliance, kind of counter to EU, potentially in the long run counter to NATO. They want Ukraine to join this alliance, and there is a rebellion against Yanukovych in Ukraine because most of Ukrainians see their future more oriented towards the West and the EU, not necessarily NATO. It's more about economy and just, being more politically free than Russia is. There is violence in Kiev, more than 100 people die, but eventually Yanukovych is deposed, he flees into Russia, and for Putin, that's the moment to act. There is a rupture, right? Russia finally, probably irreversibly lost Ukraine. Ukraine is going towards the West. So we can't just control them and force them into our alliance. So it's time to act, and Putin decides that, time has come, quote unquote, to bring Crimea home. And that's why we see those little green men, identified people with Russian military uniforms who are taking over Crimea. Of course, Putin denies that those are Russians until he stops denying. Then they're Russian, and Crimea is annexed. The more interesting story is happening in the Donbas, where Russian military originally does not appear. What happens there is that there are people in the Donbas who do want to join Russia, because they are Russian nationalists, or because they believe that their life will be better in Russia because Russia has oil and gas in the richer country than Ukraine. So they start protesting, they start declaring their own small republics and statelets. The Ukrainian government is weak. There was just a transfer of power, so the president fled. They're just trying to figure out how the next government is going to look like. So there is a vacuum of power. There are protests in eastern Ukraine, and into those protests come a group of people from Russia, almost all of them Russian citizens, most of them with deep ties to the Kremlin or the security services. Their leader is a former colonel in the FSB, a guy who fought in Bosnia, in Chechnya, in some other places, who moved there literally to start a war, to conquer those places and to start a civil war in Ukraine and force then the rest of Russia to follow them and create some kind of a new state called New Russia out of Eastern Ukraine, and hopefully even conquer Kiev in a way. And that leads to a war in the Donbas, which Russians always wanted to present as a civil war, as if Russia has nothing to do with it. It's just different Ukrainians fighting it out, those who are more pro-Russian versus those who are more pro-Western. That was also the media narrative. What is left out of this story is that people who started this war were all Russians, and Russia over time became very heavily involved in the fighting, to the extent that every time when Ukrainian military was getting close to defeating those rebels, Putin would send the Russian army in to stop the Ukrainians and then move them back. They were heavily financed by the Russian state. So it was this kind of limbo war where Russians said, we have nothing to do with it. It's just a civil war. Ukrainians were screaming, there's the Russians, all Russians out there who are fighting. There is nothing civil about it. And the West, by and large, bought this narrative that, it's mostly a civil war, and either downplayed or quite possibly not even recognized, the extent of Russian involvement in the conflict. But the war in Ukraine in 2014 was started by Russia and Russians, and without Russia, there would not have been this war in 2014, which is a prelude to the current invasion of 2022.
So, we're talking here in end of 2024 in December. So, the 3-year mark since 2022 is soon upon us. February, right? I guess February 25 is 3 years.
24th, yeah.
I guess we talked about identity and things like that and unification, all that stuff. But sincerely, so now I'm asking to jump in the mind of Putin here for a minute. What do we think? What are his motives for this invasion? What's his end game? Does he just want to completely destroy Ukraine, make it part of Russia? Like, is it more against the West and the whole thing? What do we think is legitimately? There's what he says. There's some of the elements there, but what do we think is the real motive here?
Right. So I won't try to jump into Putin's head. I think it's too dangerous, and
it is very dangerous.
Too many scary stuff out there. Yeah. And honestly, I don't think we fully understand what happened and why he invaded. Mm-hmm. We might speculate. It was a combination of things. I think for him, it was Putin himself getting older and start thinking about his historical legacy. I think him becoming a more nationalist and more true believer and more religious as time passes by. And the invasion was this combination of, doing something that will make him worthy of, great Russia's emperors, and finally bring Ukraine, quote unquote, home. Mm-hmm. it was also a pretty good time to invade. The West was weak. The US just got kicked out of Afghanistan. UK was in the middle of figuring out what it is after Brexit, elections in Germany. Everyone is still busy with COVID. So there was a good time to do something about Ukraine, not necessarily destroy and annex Ukraine. Mm. My sense is, and I might be wrong, if at some point we will see Russian archives open, we might get a different story. My sense is that the idea was to have a brief, easy regime change operation. So quickly invade, destroy the Ukrainian leadership to put some puppet in Kiev, and not necessarily annexing Kiev. Ukraine does not have to be annexed if it can be controlled. They want to control Ukraine. That's why the title of the book is Quest to Dominate Ukraine rather than annex Ukraine. They want control of it. Control doesn't mean actual physical ownership. It can be a client state like Belarus, which is technically independent, but de facto is a Russian colony. Mm. And I think he wanted something like that. So he chose a moment where the West was weak, where he was seriously thinking about his historical legacy, stuck with COVID and needing a way out because COVID was extremely painful for Russia, and decided that is a chance to move in and finally bring Ukraine under control. Not necessarily annexing it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've heard this also about during COVID, he became a little bit more nationalistic, more radicalized. He was reading a lot of history. I've heard this too, which it could be. I mean, it starts to become isolating. What is the likelihood? I mean, we hope this doesn't happen, right? But is there a point you think where, nukes are on the table? Like, is that a real possibility?
I don't know. I mean, I don't want, as I said, I don't want to jump into Putin's head because too many scary things are happening there. Yeah. I honestly doubt. Yeah. I don't think he's out to nuke us and not even nuke Ukraine. He wants control Ukraine rather than destroy it. Yeah. Right? There is no point annexing it if your goal is, he wants to go down in history as someone who brought Ukraine into Russia rather than someone who obliterated the mother of Russian cities. So is it impossible? I don't know. I'm not a military strategist. I'm not an expert on that. Hard for me to tell. I don't think anyone knows what's going on in his head. No, I think he's after control rather than destruction.
And what do we think about some of his allies now? I mean, there's North Korean soldiers over there now, but interesting. I mean, Syria kind of, Assad fell kind of in a weekend. It was very fast, and it's very fragile there right now. Nobody knows what's going to happen, what their government's going to. It's very fragile there. But Assad isn't there. I believe he's in Russia, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, he is.
Iran is a bit weakened as well, a little bit at the moment, from what we know. So I mean, he's running kind of out of allies that have actual substantial kinds of footing anywhere. I mean, does that impact or influence his next move? I mean, one other question I've had here is, does he attempt to go for Kiev again? Is that a big thing for him to go for?
Well, I don't think he has the troops to go for Kiev, at least go for Kiev militarily. Yeah. So actually what happened with Assad and, the last weekend or week and a half are extremely interesting because we have different, narratives of the history and of the future. One narrative that, we got used to over the last several years is that autocracies bail each other out. So when Putin is in trouble, China would come in and bail him out. When Maduro in Venezuela is in trouble, then, Russians will bail him out. And Iran is bailing them out when needed, but suddenly Assad falls and nobody is bailing him out. So, So on the one hand, it's very interesting. I still don't know why and what happened there and what does it mean. So on the one hand, we do have this idea of, autocratic coalition against the West, fighting against Ukraine, but Ukraine is just the first step. So over the weekend, there was a very interesting essay in Wall Street Journal by Yaroslav Trofimov asking whether the World War III already started. Whether there is this autocratic axis of Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, that just started World War, and maybe we are at the early stages of this World War that right now in Ukraine and moving out to it. So I don't know. I mean, 2 weeks ago, before Assad fell, I would say, yeah, maybe, but it's very interesting and unpredictable. I don't think he will try to go for Kiev militarily. I think the strategy for him, at least right now, is to wait for Trump to get inaugurated and try to get control over Kiev politically.
Could see that.
Rather than militarily.
Yeah.
He doesn't have, they're trying to get to Kharkiv, which is the second largest city in Ukraine. Militarily, Kiev is too far away and too large to be occupied. Ideally, he would get to a point where he would have a de facto control over Ukrainian politics without occupying.
Yeah.
So
using
dominate without annex.
Yeah. Using those old KGB skills is kind of his goal. I could see that. I definitely see it waiting until after Trump gets inaugurated. I guess the one of the last questions I have is like, what does a negotiated peace look like, in Ukraine? Hard to know, right? But at what point does, Putin say, okay, enough, I can't do anymore, or Ukraine says, look, we've got, victory, we have, this, do we get Crimea back there? What does it look like, I guess, like a long-term peace deal, or is it just a kind of, ceasefire kind of thing? What do you think the most hopeful and best outcome quickly, hopefully, is for everyone to kind of put down their swords and just, kind of live nearby? I mean, what does that look like realistically, you think?
Right. So here, for me, the key difference is between what you said, a negotiated peace versus a lasting peace.
Right.
I think we can negotiate a peace agreement, realistically speaking, or just freeze the conflict to have a ceasefire where Russia keeps the territories it occupied in exchange for something. I have no what exactly. I don't think it will bring peace. Because Putin, and not just Putin, again, we mentioned Putin, but those nationalist ideas or imperialist ideas that I mentioned, they're pretty common in the Russian society writ large. It's not just Putin.
Yeah.
As long as those ideas persist, I don't think there is much hope for a lasting peace. It will be just a postponed either war or another attempt for Russia to take control over Ukraine through non-military means. Bribing politicians, disinformation, electoral interference, you name it. The only way for me to guarantee peace is to stop focusing on territories. Territory is, of course, important, but that's not the core of the conflict. The core is how do you make Russians stop believing that Ukraine is theirs and they ought to control it. I'm quite hopeful that the war might change attitudes, if not of Putin, but people on the ground.
Sure.
They went to Ukraine, they saw how much they're hated. They lost so many people. So maybe it will start conversations about whether maybe those people are not really Russians, and maybe we don't need them at all. If those conversations do take hold, there is hope. If the Russian government, probably not Putin, but the next government, changes the discourse, changes the narrative, starts teaching people in schools that actually Ukrainians are not Russians who are being, taken away from us, but a different country. What you learn in school stays with you for many years. So it will have to be both a top-down and a bottom-up process, but there is very little we as outsiders can do about it. Right? So Ukraine can do a better job of building its military or protecting itself. We can give Ukraine some more meaningful security guarantees, or NATO membership, but essentially in the long term, it's about Russia just saying, yes, our history starts in Kiev. Yes, we come from the same source, but it's a different state now and we don't want it. Until when that happens, there will be lasting peace. Until it happens, we will be just counting days until the next round, either military or non-military.
Yeah, it's a lot of work to be done there. There's a lot there. Eugene, this has been a very illuminating, very, very important conversation. I'm very happy that you gave me your time and energy and wisdom. I greatly appreciate it. So big thanks for coming on and sharing all of your knowledge. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.